Good morning, 512 City. It's such a privilege for me today to have a conversation with John Burke. He is not only one of our local church pastors here in Austin, but he is the author of the book Imagine Heaven, and in many ways the architect of the series that we get to participate in as we're speaking through what's after ATX. John, it's great having you with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Yuri. I'm excited to be here.
Well, at 512 City Church, as the rest of the city, we've been considering this whole idea of what's after life. And I know you've devoted a lot of time and effort into this idea of what happens after life. What got you interested in this, John? Why so much effort, such a great book? What got you into this? What triggered it?
It was not my intention. I was actually an agnostic. I didn't know what I believed about God. I thought Jesus was probably just a good teacher, blown out of proportion. I didn't know if there was an afterlife or not, didn't really care. And my dad got cancer. And on his deathbed, someone gave him the very first book that wrote about what got coined near-death experiences. But really what it is when people clinically die, their heart stops beating or their brainwaves cease and they're resuscitated by modern medicine. And they talk about an experience more real than this world. And I read the book in one night and it kind of woke me up. I was like, oh my gosh, like maybe this God, Jesus stuff is real, because so many talked about seeing Jesus, meeting this God of light and love. And that opened me up. And so it was the next year that actually someone invited me into a small group Bible study, and I asked all my skeptical questions. I was an engineer, so I have to understand why. It has to make sense to me. And anyway, I came to faith in Jesus, and then ended up going from a career in engineering into ministry later, seminary and all that. But for the last 30 years, I have always wondered, how do these experiences, because I started hearing more and more and more, and I kind of started collecting them and trying to make sense of them with what the scripture says. And so after 30 years and researching over 1,000 of them, I wrote Imagine Heaven to try to show this incredible picture that I'd come to see, but also that I think it really changes your life when you realize that this life is just the beginning of the story. If it's just chapter one, it changes how you read the story, right? How you live the story.
But I mean, John, you going into this as an agnostic and not really, so you weren't seeking Jesus as much as you were seeking answers about what was happening to your dad.
I was just curious. Yeah. And it was these stories that opened me up to actually exploring faith. Now, I came to faith in Jesus for completely different reasons than near-death experiences. I actually, as an engineer and analytical-minded person, started to see that God has been putting, he's put foretelling prophetic things in history for thousands of years, proof positive and validated in history. That convinced me more than anything. But I think these near-death experiences are one more line of evidence in our modern scientific age, when you have literally, the Gallup poll found 1 out of 25 people have had one of these near-death experiences. That's millions in America alone, and they're all across the globe. So I think it's a whole new line of evidence in our global age that God is the God of all nations, of all people, and wants all people to be with him.
That's amazing, John. So here's a question I got on Facebook from one of these videos this week. Okay, somebody came in and the question they wrote is, I don't know this person personally, but they found us on Facebook and they said, "What's your agenda? What are you trying to sell here?" And I thought it was, initially I was slightly offended. I was thinking we're just trying to love the city and look after people. Then I thought, this is a pretty legit question. How do we know that this isn't just some gimmick, some flaky thing? I mean, you were an engineer. how does an engineer become completely convinced and taken up by life after death, something as fuzzy and hard to get your arms around as this? What's the play here? What's the agenda? What are we trying to do? Sell books through sensationalism, or what's the deal?
Well, and to that person, I would say, actually, we're giving the book away. You can go out to What's After ATX and get it for free.
That doesn't make any business sense whatsoever, John.
Well, because if it's all true, right? There's nothing more important in this life than God, the one who created you, and the one who loves you more than you even love yourself or know yourself. And actually, I believe that all this helps make sense of life and what we're doing here and what's wrong with life, and what we need to do to get more of heaven into earth and the way we relate to one another today. And so that's my motive in it. It was the motive that caused me to leave engineering and do this full time. But you know, it's also in Imagine Heaven and the What's After Life booklet, I tried to focus on people who couldn't possibly have any other motive. I mean, we're talking about spine surgeons, college professors who were tenured and were atheists. You know, people who are successful business owners living on a golf course in Houston. You know, I think you're about to interview him. Bank presidents, CEOs who have been on the cover of Time magazine. Now, how do you get people like that to, you know, talk about these experiences that people look at them like, you're nuts, you're crazy? It doesn't help their career. What's their motive? It's definitely not to sell books. If
anything, it kind of makes them, you know, look a little flaky from a purely, I want to say, you know, a purely logical point of view. There is no agenda, but there's a logic or a reality above this. And you've said this a couple of times, but it's been interesting for me. Every one of these interviews I've done, there's been this phrase that came up every time. What I experienced there was more real than anything I've experienced on earth. And I guess that's the...
Yeah, and I liken it to this. Imagine if, you know, if you live here in Austin, you've been out to the Oasis, like looking over Lake Travis, beautiful, right? Now imagine looking at a black and white photo of the lake and the hills and the mansions and all that. That is a very limited experience of a three-dimensional reality. If you're standing there and looking all around, surrounded by the beauty, it's and not black and white, it's in color. It just comes alive in a whole new way. And that's a limited experience of the fourth dimension of time. Like I've had memories out there since I was in college. My daughter got engaged out there. We've had so many great days dancing and, you know, having dinner on the lake. And now imagine if our four dimensions, three dimensions of space, one dimension of time, is really like that black and white photo to the fifth, sixth, seventh, however many eternal dimensions to come. Well, that's exactly what God has told us in the scriptures. And it's what these people verify. That, you know, imagine trying to go back now into a flat black and white painting and describe three dimensions of color in flat black and white terms. Think of how hard that would be. And that's what these people are trying to do. That's why it's more real. And by the way, what's fascinating, you know, I mean, what I was trying to show in Imagine Heaven is that it's not like God all of a sudden in our modern medical age is suddenly revealing himself through these NDEs. He's been telling us this all along through the Jewish prophets. It's why he created the Jewish nation. You know, back in Genesis 12:3, he said he created the Jewish nation to bless all nations. You know, it's always been for the whole world. And so, for instance, in Hebrews chapter 8, it talks about how the tabernacle that Moses made, God showed him and said, make it like this. And it was a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. So you stop and think about it. And all of nature, represents the glory of God to some degree, but a lesser degree. And that's what these people are saying, that what we are experiencing is a shrunk down experience of the life we were created to live. It's a lesser than what's to come.
Wow. And I mean, that just changes our entire perspective. And thinking of that, though, John, is if we, I mean, this series was planned months ago, right? So was it more than a year ago? What caused you to go, let's do a citywide series about what's after life?
Yeah, 3 years ago, the group of pastors, Christ Together, asked me, hey, would you be willing to take Imagine Heaven and, you know, make it into a shorter little booklet, you know, that we could give away, and we'll do a citywide conversation on it. And so we started planning that 3 years ago, and it just so happens, maybe not, maybe providentially, that it's right in the middle of COVID-19 when everybody's thinking about life and death issues, and we're not in as much control as we thought. And gosh, look how one person getting a virus can spread across the globe and shut the whole globe down. How interconnected are we? And what's it all really about? And people are asking these questions. So I absolutely think it was God's timing.
Wow. And I mean, it's been amazing to see the impact and how God just orchestrated all these things at the right time to happen. But here's another difficult question that we got recently is if God uses these near-death experiences, does God cause people to die in order for them to have a message to tell us? And I think this is really relevant right now in the season, because I think a lot of people are asking about the origins of this pandemic, right? Is this the wrath of God poured out over the world? Is this God saving the planet because, you know, we're not looking after this? What's happening here? Is God causing these things to happen so that we get the message? What's your thoughts on that, John? Some easy questions for everybody.
Yeah, if only I had the mind of God to answer, right? But you know, no, I think Jesus got asked this question. So some people came to Jesus because this tower, the Tower of Siloam, fell on a bunch of Jewish people and killed them. And they basically came to him and said, you know, hey, apparently they were worse sinners than everybody else. And Jesus said, no, you know, you think bad things happened to them because they were worse sinners? Or when Pilate, you know, murdered all these people in the temple, you think it was because they were worse sinners? And he said no. So therefore, I think on the one hand, we got to be really careful saying, oh, this is God's this, that, or the other. On the other hand, Jesus said, but all these things, this is my paraphrase, are warning signs to wake up and turn back to God. Because, you know, the whole problem with humanity is all of us seek my will and ways way more than we seek God or God's will and ways. You know, and if you don't believe me, just test yourself. One day, just pay attention to how much you think about what you've got to do and what you want to do and what needs to happen and how you can fix this or that or the other, versus how much you consult God. What do you want to do? What are you doing? What do you want me to do here? How do I follow your will for this world? How do I, you know, Jesus taught us to pray, Father, your will be done on earth. Well, how does that happen? Well, only through me. Your will be done through me as it's done in heaven. Well, it's not. The reason Jesus taught us to pray that, it's not usually done on earth as in heaven. So anyway, yeah, I think on the one hand, I would be very hesitant to say, oh yeah, God is doing this to punish the world or reset, you know, the way we've treated creation. And maybe it is some of that. I don't know. I have no idea. But what I do know is, you know, all the things that happen, God does allow. And he allows it for a purpose, and the purpose is always love. It's always to draw us back to himself in love. And
I love that. I love that. God is fundamentally good. The world is fundamentally broken because of sin. and God will use all things together for the good, for his purpose and his plan. That's really good, John. Really good.
Well,
So,
think of,
yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you guys have interviewed any of the guys who've had hellish near-death experiences yet. Have you?
Well, I mean, spoke to Bishop Paulo a week ago, and he kind of has an initial, moment where he kind of falls into this pit, and there's this absence of God that he's never felt in his entire life.
Well, the reason I ask is because I think, the follow-up question to what we just talked about is, why would a loving God allow so much suffering? Yeah. Right? And I think we tend to think about it from an earth perspective. In other words, we're thinking about it from a finite, limited, four-dimensional, temporary perspective. And we tend to think, well, we're temporal creatures. Why in the world would God punish someone for eternity? That's so unfair. And from that perspective, yes, it is. But what if instead we're eternal creatures? Wow. In other words, we are made eternal. We are eternal. We will continue on after this life. And God created us for love, but love can't be forced. I can love you, but I can't put a gun to your head and say, love me, and force you to love me, or, you can't do that with anybody, right? You can't buy love either. So it has to be chosen freely. And God submits himself to the way he created love. So he creates us free, but he also creates us for a time. He starts us off in the knowledge of good and evil. So what the Bible says. We are in a time of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's a time of choosing. He says today is the day to choose him. And so I believe what's happening, and I think ND ears attest to this when they say, I felt like I had 50 senses, not 5 senses. Wow. And that's true of heavenly experience, but it's also true of hellish experience. So if we are eternal creatures who either choose God, and by the way, that's what God was doing through Jesus. He was making a way so everybody can be with him forever. He removed every barrier between every person and himself except one, our pride. If we want to play God and say, I don't need God, I will be God, my will be done. And God, you just leave me alone, stay out of my life. Eventually, he gives free-willed creatures what they desire. But there's only one place where God eternally stays out. And if you're gonna interview Howard Storm, you'll see.
He's with us on Sunday morning, so we'll definitely dig into that. But I think something that struck me though, just in these conversations, is everybody that describes heaven says heaven, the pearly streets, the golden, the pearly gates, the golden streets. These things are there, but they're irrelevant in the sight of Jesus and the presence of Jesus. And then everybody that describes hell says, yes, there's demons and it's terrible and it's the worst thing I've ever seen. But the worst of the worst of the worst was the absence of God. So this idea of presence of God and absence of God between these just really, it's kind of taken my heart in a whole new way, where I felt like, you know what? And there's a part of that presence that we get to have in the midst of our current circumstances, whether it's golden streets and pearly gates or coronavirus pandemic. It doesn't really matter. We have access to the presence of God on earth. How has this experience, this study, the 1,000+ people that you've spoken to, how has it changed your perspective and impacted the way you're dealing with COVID-19 and doing this from your home as opposed to standing in front of a crowd of people?
Well, I think perhaps God orchestrated it so that it will be online, and so many more people can hear and know about the way God feels about them. It's everybody. He created everybody, and he created everybody in love for his love. And I do think what you're saying is so important, that we all long to be loved. I mean, it's the grand motivator of humanity. You know, you can deny it, but if you deny it, it's probably because love hurt you, because people hurt you, and you didn't get the love that you know deep inside you were created for. And think about that. I mean, as much as we long for love and relationship, I mean, just think about the billions, millions, probably billions of love songs written over the centuries. It's the grand motivator. And yet, why is it so difficult on planet Earth? You know, why do people who love each other enough to commit themselves in marriage, 50% don't make it? You know, it's like, what's wrong? Well, you know, C.S. Lewis said, if there's a desire in us, you know, he said, you know, people have a desire for, they have a hunger, a desire within, and sure enough, there's food to meet that. You know, ducklings have a desire to swim, and sure enough, there's water to swim in. And he says, if there is a desire or a hunger in humanity that nothing in this world can satisfy, that probably means we were made for another world. Wow. And I'm convinced that all the love we experience, all the love we desire, all the love we can't seem to get or give very well, is all because, yes, God is with us, but also we're not 100% present with him and fully yielded to him, to his will be done fully. And that when we are face to face with him, and this is what these people say over and over and over again, that when you look into the eyes of the one who created you, you will feel like you're finally home. You'll realize this is what I've been longing for my whole life. This is so wanted and strove for and did everything for, and yet nothing quite lived up. And I do think that it helps right now as well, because that doesn't minimize the relational experiences we have. It heightens them. Wow. So when I look into the eyes of my son or my daughter and I feel love, I realize this is derivative. The love I feel for my son and daughter is from God, and it's how he feels about me, but even more so. Wow. And that's true of spouse, of lover, of kids, of grandkids. You know, all our relationships are just a small little taste of the ocean of love that God has for all of us.
Well, and I think that makes me think of that concept that it's better to give than to receive, right? And I've spoken to so many people in the season that says, I've been able to reach out to neighbors. I've been able to, you know, provide food for someone else. I've been able to care for someone, go get groceries for them. And how much it's meant to people to be able to show love. It's better to show love than to receive love, even, because there's a greater source behind this, right? It addresses that void in us, that God void that everybody has, that desire for more, which you had years ago, and you know, your father's pending death was something that triggered you looking for it.
Yeah. And you know, it's fascinating, but the life reviews that people have during near-death experiences all across the globe is almost always in the presence of this God of light and love who knows them better than they know themselves. And when they come back, universally, they say two things. They realize God is love. The Bible tells us that. And how we treat one another is the most important thing to God, how we love one another. Well, Moses told us that. Jesus reiterated that. And yeah, so I think, you know, even as our plans are frustrated, or there's, you know, struggle about what's going to happen now and finances or jobs or all that, I think what we can hold on to is God still is in control, and he wants to use this to draw us to himself more in love and to love the people around us as much as we can during this time. And that's the best way to make the most of it.
I love it. God is love, and how we love others matter. And that's the way we make the most of this season and this time. John, thank you so much for being with us today. Any final words of hope as we wrap this up? What gives you hope in this season?
Well, I think, like I said before, God is at work. He always is. And he's always drawing us closer to himself if we'll respond. And so I look at this season and I go, yeah, there's something important happening. And I think there is an opportunity to reset. I think for many of us, we're having to spend more time, not just busy. And that's a great opportunity for reflection, for prayer, for getting into the scriptures, learning more about God. We're having to spend more time with families. We've already finished Netflix, so what now? Right? And to not miss that. To not miss that, and even reaching out, if you're single, even reaching out to coworkers and friends and checking in on them, and to know, again, the hope is that no matter what happens in this life, this is the beginning of the story, not the end.
That's it. I love that. This is the beginning of the story. John Burke, thank you so much for being with me this morning, but also thank you for just following the call of God upon your life. Appreciate you sharing the story, taking the time, doing the research, writing so eloquently. I love how you in Imagine Heaven not only depict the stories, but you create the foundation of how this is biblical, how this is a God story that we get to partake in. And it's a privilege as somebody God has called to this city to be able to labor in alongside and behind some of the great work you've done already, John. So thank you so much for being with 512 City Church digitally today and for what you're doing. And we're praying for Gateway Church in the season. I know a lot of churches are going through the process of multiple reinventions, but I have a lot of hope that God's also going to use that to bring about great change. If you've joined us online today, thank you for joining us. We're continuing with these interviews, and actually Howard Storm, that we referred to just a little earlier, that had a hellish experience. We're talking about that reality of hell this Sunday morning at 512 City Church. So do consider tuning in at 10 a.m. Thank you so much for being with us today.